This was not just a war of trenches and artillery. It was not only fought with bayonets and barbed wire, or with poison gas drifting over the fields of Belgium and France. World War I was also a financial war, one fought in gold reserves, in bond markets, in central banks, and in the secret offices of financiers who never once set foot on a battlefield. The soldiers paid in blood, but the bankers and governments were calculating balance sheets. And what they did in those years not only determined who won and who lost, it also rewired the global financial system in ways that are still shaping your economic reality today. If you think war is simply about politics and armies, think again. The First World War proved that money is a weapon, and one of the deadliest ever invented. In 1914, Europe was already a powder keg. National rivalries, colonial ambitions, and military alliances had turned the continent into a chessboard of paranoia and suspicion. But beneath all the speeches about honor and empire, there was a financial reality that almost nobody wanted to say out loud. War on this scale was impossible to fight without unimaginable sums of money. And here is the brutal truth that every government understood but none admitted to its people. When leaders chose war, they were also choosing debt. Every empire marching its troops to the front line was simultaneously marching its citizens into a future of economic burden that would last for generations. Yet at the start of the war, most governments genuinely believed it would be short. Maybe over by Christmas, some said. A few months of fighting, a decisive victory, a quick settlement. They thought they could pay for it the old-fashioned way, with gold, with limited borrowing, with patriotic donations from enthusiastic citizens. Within weeks, that illusion collapsed completely. The war was burning through money faster than anyone had thought possible, faster than any model, any estimate, any historical precedent could have predicted. Let's be precise about what was actually happening. In the summer of 1914, the financial system of the entire Western world still revolved around the gold standard. Nations promised that their paper money could be exchanged for actual gold at a fixed rate. It was a system that gave currencies their credibility, that made international trade function smoothly, and that fundamentally tied the hands of governments that might otherwise be tempted to spend beyond their means. Gold reserves were finite. You could not just print money endlessly without losing the trust of your own people, your trading partners, and your creditors abroad. Britain, France, and Germany all had respectable gold reserves when the war began. But once millions of men were mobilized, once entire industrial economies were redirected toward weapons production, once the logistical demands of modern industrial warfare became clear, the costs skyrocketed to levels that would have seemed science fiction just months earlier. Germany alone was spending over 10 million marks per day by late 1914. Britain's war costs would soon reach £2.5 million every single day. The math was merciless and unavoidable. The gold would not last. It was not even close. So the government suspended the rules. One by one, the major powers quietly abandoned the gold standard, admitting in the most understated bureaucratic language possible that money was now, essentially, a promise backed by nothing more than faith in the state. No gold, no physical anchor, just trust, and the printing press. And that moment, the breaking of the gold anchor, was one of the most important financial shifts in all of modern history. It was the moment when governments discovered that money could be decoupled from reality, that the supply of currency could be expanded not by mining gold from the earth but simply by deciding to create more of it. And once governments tasted that freedom, they never truly went back. The financial war now began in earnest, and each belligerent fought it according to its own strengths and weaknesses. For Germany, isolated from global capital markets by British naval supremacy and the Royal Navy's brutal blockade of its ports, the only real option was domestic borrowing. Berlin launched massive bond drives, appealing directly to the patriotism of ordinary citizens, urging families across the country to pour their savings into what were called war loans. The propaganda was relentless and sophisticated. Posters showed heroic soldiers defending the fatherland. Families were urged to sacrifice their luxuries, their comfort, their future savings, for the cause. And constant promises were made, investors would be repaid after victory. Victory was certain. Victory was inevitable. Just keep buying. In total, Germany raised over 100 billion marks this way, a staggering sum extracted from its own population. But it was a pyramid built entirely on hope, specifically the hope of winning. When defeat came instead, those bonds were worth nothing. Millions of German families watched their life savings evaporate overnight. Teachers, factory workers, small shopkeepers, retired civil servants, people who had done exactly what their government told them to do, gave their money to the state and trusted it would come back. It never did. That bitterness, that sense of profound betrayal, did not simply fade away. It became fertile ground for extremism in the decades that followed. Economic history always leaves scars, and sometimes those scars change everything. Britain, by contrast, had one immense structural advantage: the City of London was still the financial hub of the world in 1914. Sterling was trusted globally. British financial networks reached across every continent. At first, the government leaned on short-term borrowing, treasury bills, and patriotic appeals not unlike Germany's. But very quickly it became clear that domestic resources alone were not enough. Britain needed to tap into the deeper pools of global credit, and that meant turning to the one major economy that was, at least officially, staying out of the war. The United States in 1914 was neutral in name but anything but neutral in financial interest. American bankers smelled opportunity on a historic scale. Firms like J.P. Morgan and Company became the financial lifeline of Britain and France, arranging vast loans, coordinating the purchase of weapons, food, raw materials, and ammunition on an almost incomprehensible scale. By 1917, when America itself finally entered the war, Wall Street had already been bankrolling the Allied cause for 3 years. This was not charity. This was not idealism. This was power, calculated and deliberate. American bankers earned tens of millions in fees and commissions. American industry boomed supplying the Allied war machine, and the United States was quietly, methodically, transforming its position in the global financial order. Before the war, America was a debtor nation, borrowing from European capital markets to build its railroads and factories. After the war, it held the world's largest gold reserves and the world's largest creditor position. If you have ever wondered how the 20th century became the American century, this is where it truly begins. Not on the battlefields of the Western Front, but in the ledgers of Wall Street banks. France faced its own particular dilemmas. Already weakened by decades of spending to fortify its borders against Germany, and still psychologically scarred by the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, France relied heavily on a combination of domestic loans and international credit. French citizens, long famous across Europe as disciplined and enthusiastic savers, were persuaded in large numbers to buy government bonds. But much of the deeper structural funding again came from across the Atlantic. France, like Britain, became increasingly dependent on American capital as the war dragged on year after year. And this dependency would have profound political consequences after the war ended, when the weight of repayment became a source of constant tension between former allies who were supposed to be celebrating the same victory. Russia tells perhaps the most dramatic story of all, and the most instructive. The Russian Empire was vast, its geography almost incomprehensible, and its gold reserves impressive on paper. But underneath that surface impression was a banking system that was genuinely fragile, an industrial base far behind Germany or Britain, and a government that had neither the administrative capacity nor the financial sophistication to manage the demands of modern total war. Russia borrowed heavily from its allies, particularly from France, which had been its main financial partner for decades before the war. But as military defeats accumulated, as inflation surged and the purchasing power of ordinary Russians collapsed, faith in the ruble evaporated. By 1917, the Russian economy was not just struggling, it was in complete disintegration. And here is the point that most military histories skip over entirely. The collapse of the Tsarist regime in 1917 was not simply about bad generals, or revolutionary ideology, or even the staggering human cost of the war, though all of those things mattered. It was also about a financial system stretched so far beyond its limits that it simply snapped. Hyperinflation destroyed the living standards of urban workers and soldiers alike. The inability to supply the army was as much a financial failure as a logistical one. Economic collapse preceded political collapse and enabled it. Money and power marched together into one of the most consequential revolutions in human history. The scale of the overall financial destruction was staggering when you add it all up. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, the Allied powers had spent more than $140 billion. The Central Powers had spent around $60 billion. These were sums the world had genuinely never seen before, equal to many times the total pre-war national incomes of all the countries involved. The result was not only mountains of debt stretching decades into the future, it was the complete destruction of the old financial order that had governed the Western world since the 19th century. The gold standard, once the unquestioned foundation of global financial trust, had been shattered beyond easy repair. Inflation had ripped through every major economy, and ordinary people, workers, savers, small investors, the people who had answered their government's call and handed over their savings in exchange for patriotic bonds, were the ones who paid the heaviest price. The wealthy elites, meanwhile, had quietly protected themselves by moving assets abroad, by purchasing real goods and property, by staying close to the centers of power where information about policy changes arrived first. The lesson was brutal but unmistakable. In a financial war, the small saver bleeds first. That was true in 1914. It has remained true ever since. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world resembled a battlefield not just in its physical landscape of shell craters and ruined cities, but in its economic landscape of shattered balance sheets and impossible obligations. The United States now held the world's largest gold reserves and the largest creditor position in the entire history of international finance. Europe, the old heart of global civilization and global capital, was drowning in debt. Britain owed the United States over $4 billion. France owed more than $3 billion. Smaller nations were entangled in webs of obligation they could never realistically hope to repay. The war had accomplished something no cannon could have achieved. It had permanently displaced London and elevated Wall Street as the true capital of global finance. The age of American economic dominance had begun, and it had begun not in peacetime prosperity but in the financial wreckage of the most destructive war in history up to that point. But this transition was anything but smooth, because here is the trap that nobody in 1918 fully understood, or perhaps nobody wanted to understand. When wars are funded by borrowing on this scale, repayment becomes its own war. Britain and France, desperate to maintain the confidence of their own citizens who had bought billions in war bonds, needed Germany to pay. The Treaty of Versailles demanded an astronomical sum in reparations, 132 billion gold marks, a number chosen more for its psychological and political impact than for any realistic assessment of what Germany could actually transfer. It was meant to punish, it was meant to cripple, it was meant to shift the entire financial burden of the war onto the defeated nation. But it was also a fantasy, and serious economists at the time, including a young John Maynard Keynes who resigned from the British delegation in protest, said so loudly and clearly, Germany simply could not pay. Every attempt to do so, whether through printing money or transferring goods and industrial output, destabilized its economy further and triggered political crises that made the next payment even less likely. The hyperinflation of 1923, when the German mark became so worthless that workers demanded to be paid twice a day before prices could rise again, when people genuinely carted wheelbarrows of banknotes just to buy a loaf of bread, was not some mysterious economic accident. It was the direct, predictable consequence of a financial system that had been pushed past every rational limit by war, then forced into an impossible repayment structure by the victors. And it planted seeds of rage and humiliation that political extremists would spend the next decade carefully watering. Meanwhile, Britain, anxious to restore its financial prestige and its position at the center of global trade, made one of the most consequential policy errors of the entire interwar period. In 1925, under a Chancellor of the Exchequer named Winston Churchill, Britain returned to the gold standard at the old pre-war exchange rate, as if the economy had not been fundamentally transformed by 4 years of industrial slaughter, as if the debts had not been accumulated, as if the industrial base had not been weakened, as if nothing had fundamentally changed. It was the economic equivalent of forcing a badly broken limb back into its original position without first allowing the bone to heal. The result was exactly what any honest analysis would have predicted: deflation, falling wages, mass unemployment, and years of social unrest. The workers who had fought the war, or whose fathers had fought it, paid the price for an elite policy designed to restore the prestige of the pound sterling. It is now remembered by economic historians as one of the worst monetary policy decisions in modern British history. The United States, sitting on its mountain of gold and credit, faced a completely different kind of challenge. What do you do with overwhelming financial dominance in a world that is simultaneously your customer and your debtor? American banks began pouring money back into Europe, lending enormous sums to Germany so that Germany could pay reparations to Britain and France, who could then service their debts back to American creditors. It was a circular flow of capital that created the appearance of stability and recovery, a kind of financial perpetual motion machine. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 formalized and institutionalized this circular logic, giving it official names and diplomatic respectability. But money was not being created by this process. It was simply being recycled, with each rotation accumulating more fragility, more dependency, more systemic risk. And when the global economy finally shuddered in the autumn of 1929, the entire interlocking structure collapsed at once, simultaneously, across every major economy. The world had never been so financially interconnected, and it had never been so fragile precisely because of that interconnection. This is why the First World War cannot be understood simply as a chapter in military history, or even in political history. It was a turning point in the history of money itself. It was the moment when governments of modern industrial states discovered the full range of tools available to them for financing the unimaginable, abandoning gold, expanding the money supply, issuing debt to their own citizens, borrowing across borders, and then managing the resulting chaos through a combination of technical restructuring and sustained propaganda. It proved that ordinary savers could be convinced to hand over their accumulated wealth in exchange for bonds that would never be fully repaid. It proved that the real winners of industrial war were often those who sat in boardrooms, not those who carried rifles. And it fused money and political power together more tightly than they had ever been before, a fusion that has never been undone. Now think about the present moment. When central banks announce that inflation is temporary and that the fundamentals remain sound, remember that governments in 1914 were saying almost identical things, right up until the currencies their citizens were holding became worthless. When governments expand debt ceilings year after year, when new money is created digitally at the stroke of a key, when bond markets are described in patriotic or civic terms, remember that none of this is new. The gold standard was not abandoned by accident in 1914. It was abandoned by design, in a moment of desperation, by governments that had no other choice and were unwilling to admit it publicly. The pattern that followed, borrowing against the future to cover the costs of the present, selling debt with the language of duty and stability, is more than a century old and has never truly stopped. Every financial crisis of the modern era has roots that trace back to those war years. The stagflation of the 1970s, the savings and loan collapse of the 1980s, the Asian financial crisis, the subprime catastrophe of 2008. Each of these events has its own specific triggers, its own cast of characters, its own technical details. But underneath all of them runs the same foundational logic that was established between 1914 and 1918. Money untethered from physical reality becomes a tool of political management, and the costs of that management are almost always distributed away from those who hold power and toward those who do not. The hidden financial war behind World War I is not a relic of a distant past. It is the foundation on which the present financial system was constructed. The lesson it offers is uncomfortable but necessary. Money, once detached from a physical anchor, becomes as much a political instrument as a medium of exchange. Governments will always find ways to finance what they have decided to do, whether that is war, or bailouts, or stimulus, or the management of a crisis. And they will always find ways, subtle or obvious, to make the broader population bear the cost, whether through direct taxation, through inflation that quietly erodes the purchasing power of savings, or through the long slow erosion of real wages relative to asset prices. Real financial literacy is not about knowing which stocks to buy or which currency to hold. It is about understanding the system well enough to see through the language used to describe it. History does not repeat itself exactly, but the patterns it generates are recognizable if you know what to look for. The financial playbook written in 1914 has been used again and again in the century since, always dressed in new language, always presented with new justification suited to the moment, but always following the same essential logic, and the outcome has been remarkably consistent. Those with knowledge, proximity to power, and access to real assets find ways to protect themselves. Those without those advantages absorb the losses. If you take one thing from everything covered in this video, let it be this: never assume money is real simply because it is printed and officially sanctioned. And never assume a financial system is stable simply because the people running it tell you it is. The truth is always in the numbers, always in the balance sheets, always in the historical record. And history, if you know how to read it, does not lie.